Hello and welcome to this month's Sustainability Watch webcast. I'm Uwe Schulte, your host for today and moderator, and I am very pleased that so many people have registered for this webcast, and I'm even more pleased about a very uh, experienced and knowledgeable panel, which I will introduce in a minute. But before we do that and start talking about sustainability and governance and what the role of the board is in that, let me just explain a few um, housekeeping items. So the webcast is executed in a way that you can ask questions at any point in time, and please feel free to do so. In order to do it, use the chat box on the bottom left corner of your screen, and we will attend to the questions either immediately or when it is appropriate during the course of the webcast. All the presentations you see can be downloaded in the box that's next to the chat box. So you just click on it and they are there for your download. It also contains a number of reference presentations and files for your convenience. You can, if you feel that you want to see most of the slide content, click on the icons on the top right corner, 4 arrows, and then you get to a full screen mode. By clicking again, you back into this format. After the this session is recorded, and after the meeting, your colleagues can download this and watch the webcast after the event. Of course, that is then not with the live features of questions and answers. You can earn CPE credits for this webcast. You have to attend the whole meeting, and during the meeting, prompts will pop up, and you will have to click on them. And that feature is, of course, only available in the live webcast. That brings me to introducing our panel. We have Hannah Saltman, who works for Ceres, where she partners with corporate boards, investors, and key governance partners to integrate material sustainability risks and opportunities into board decision-making. She is driving strong long-term financial performance and increase operations competitive advantage in doing so. She leads the team's work on providing board oversight recommendations for companies and investors on environmental and social issues, and has co-authored and contributed to a number of Ceres reports on board sustainability governance. Welcome, Hannah. Okay. Our second participant is David Katz. He's a partner at Watchell, Lipton, Rosen and Katz in New York City, and adjunct professor at the New York University School of Law, and co-chair of the Board of Advisors of the NYU Law Institute for Corporate Governance and Finance. Mr. Katz is a corporate attorney focusing on mergers and acquisitions, corporate governance, shareholder activism, and complex security transactions. He frequently counsels boards of directors and board committees on corporate governance matters and crisis management. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much.
So, let's, sorry, we lost a little bit the sequence of the slides here, but let me please very briefly introduce the Sustainability Center of the Conference Board. We provide our members with research that focuses on creating long-term value and positive impact through the integration of sustainability. We try to provide timely and thought-provoking and relevant research. We are guided by the UN Sustainable Development Goals and, of course, the responsible standards and frameworks for corporate governance and working. We want to be fact-based, and we are independent. So in that sense, we provide members with research, but also with webcasts, podcasts, and such like. If you're interested, just get in contact with us. Okay, so let's get started now on governance and sustainability and the board's role in this. Hannah, I understand you've undertaken quite a lot of research in this field and the role of the board in driving environmental, social, and governance performance. Can you tell us a little bit about what your findings are?
Yes, thank you, Uwe. It's wonderful to be here and really looking forward to today's conversation. So I'm a manager on the governance program at Ceres, which is a nonprofit organization working with some of the largest companies and investors to evaluate environmental and social issues as business risks and opportunities. So we do this through four main networks. The first is our company network, which is over 60 major corporations, many of which are Fortune 500 firms, working across a wide variety of sectors that have committed to working with Ceres to integrate sustainability issues from the supply chain all the way up to their boardroom to realize a competitive advantage. The second is our investor network, which is over 160 investors that represent a collective 25 trillion in assets under management that work both to...
Hannah, we're losing your sound at the moment. I'm sorry. Apologies for that little technical glitch. I hope Hannah will be back in a second. I'm waiting for our technical support to give us an indication.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you, Hannah. Thank you. Sorry for this.
Not a problem. So the second network that we work with is our investor network, which is about 160 investors that represent a collective 25 trillion in assets under management that work to both scale opportunities for investments in clean energy and other sustainability areas, as well as who have committed to engaging with their own portfolio companies to really investigate whether their companies have future-proof their business for potential impact from various ESG topics. The third network is our policy network, which is a group of about 45 leading companies in the United States that have committed to working with Ceres to advocate at both the state and federal levels for robust climate and clean energy policies. And our fourth network is our nonprofit network, which is about 120 similar nonprofits that have agreed to working with Ceres to both participate in our corporate stakeholder engagement as issue experts, as well as nonprofits who work with us on similar topics around sustainability disclosure, governance, and other environmental and social topic areas. So I work on our board governance program in particular, and our mission is to support corporate boards in adopting effective oversight practices for sustainability. So we focus on the board for a few reasons. The first is, of course, they sit at the top of an organization's management structure. They're responsible for setting the incentive structure for top CEOs and other C-suite executives. And of course, they're fiduciaries to their investors.
Hannah, may I briefly interrupt you? I'm very sorry. Your sound at the moment is relatively muffled, and you have such important things to say. We're trying to improve the sound whilst we stop you for a second. Sorry for this additional complication. I would like to address in the meantime the audience very briefly to point out to you that on the bottom left-hand corner you can ask questions at any point in time, or you can make statements which we will happily incorporate in our discussion. So feel free to do that. It is a wide-ranging subject. We will not be able to cover everything. So if certain questions are very close to your heart, then it is a good idea if you post your question now, then we can incorporate this more easily in our discussions. If the sound problem with Hannah, it takes a little bit longer, we would then Um, okay, Hannah, I understand the sound is okay now. Let's try. Okay, it's more difficult than we thought. Let's stop here, and I'm very sorry for this confusion. David, can we sort of start talking a little bit about your experience? I mean, you've been teaching that subject at the university, and in your practical experience, you have been seeing the development of the board engagement with environmental, social, and governance issues. Can you talk a little bit about how you see that development over the last 10 years or so?
Sure, thanks, Hugh. Sustainability really has been the catalyst for the ESG movement in many different ways. Obviously, we're focusing on the E and the S. Sustainability isn't really a governance issue per se, but it has developed into a risk issue that, frankly, almost every company would need to be focused on, despite whether they're in the service industry or they're in the manufacturing industry or otherwise. We first saw sustainability come up as part of shareholder proposals. Those are non-binding proposals that are submitted to the board of directors within certain timeframes, and the SEC here in the United States mandates that those shareholder proposals be included as part of the company's proxy statement. So it's a very inexpensive way for shareholders who hold minimal amounts of securities to get their questions or issues put to the board. At first, these proposals did not get a lot of support, but as the ESG movement and climate change and sustainability generally have become more important issues, institutional investors gave widespread support to the sustainability movement, and many shareholder proposals were either approved or companies reached an agreement with the proponent of the shareholder proposals to take them offline. What they would then do is the proposals often focused on reports to the board of directors that had to be made by the company's management team, and then ultimately were provided to shareholders in one manner or another, usually through the company's website. It was through this reporting requirement that boards of directors started to get involved in sustainability. We've now graduated from that in that most public companies actually do annual sustainability reports where they report on their company's particular experiences and contributions on sustainability. Sometimes it focuses on climate change, sometimes it does not, but the sustainability issue has become a widespread concern. So much so that it's really been implemented into enterprise risk management. And the enterprise risk management system then takes into account sustainability. What that then does is it goes into the board of directors. The board of directors obviously should be very involved in enterprise risk management. It may happen primarily through the audit committee or another committee of the board, but in our view, it is something that the entire board needs to be apprised of and involved with. Therefore, frankly, at almost every board meeting where enterprise risk management issues are discussed, the sustainability and climate change issues come into play. And we see that really being the pivot point for which many other environmental and social as well as governance issues are being put to boards of directors in today's world. At first, I would tell you that boards were not very involved in this. It was mostly a management item. In recent years, boards have become very involved in this. Hannah, I think, can speak to some of the statistics that, oftentimes there's a single board member that's seen as expert. In our view, that's not best practice. You can have expertise of a single board member, but it would be much better that the entire board be involved in the issues.
The interesting thing for me, David, is when I listen to you, we've been observing this around the world. It's not just in the US, of course, that this is happening, and investors are much more engaged in the investors' calls and ESG questions as well. That is also an obvious trend. And we have, of course, a number of rating agencies that look at that. What I feel is that there is some shortcoming in the governance element of the ESG rating, the governance element, because if you look at the case of PG&E, where they had very high ratings on governance, and then they fail for governance reasons. Do you see it differently?
I think that it really depends on the particular company. One of the major issues that I think we all face on both sides of the table, whether you're on the investor side or on the board side, is frankly, there is no good measure of ESG in today's world. There are a number of different indexes or ratings, but frankly, they tend to focus on specific issues as opposed to ESG as a whole. The key question is ultimately going to be if institutional investors, through their stewardship guidelines, and boards of directors through their governance guidelines, can really come to the same place. And if we can get some independent way to measure ESG performance of boards and companies, that would be very helpful. The PG&E example is simply indicative of that. They may have been very involved on a number of issues that got them high ratings, but the fact of the matter is that they didn't focus on how sustainability really impacted their business plan and how their business plan should be modified to take sustainability into account. Ultimately, sustainability needs to be not just part of the ERM network, but it needs to be part of the strategic operations of the company inputs. And so it's considered at the appropriate place. That means both management and the board need to be involved and be thinking about these issues. And the board's role, while an oversight role, really focuses on making sure that management is taking the steps here to focus on these issues. It's not the board's responsibility to make business judgments about them, but they can certainly give their inputs, involvement, and make sure that the company's strategy reflects their perspective.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective on the case, and I appreciate what you're saying. I'm wondering, sustainability has been sort of for quite a while in a corner. Specialists were talking about it. It got very involved in discussions, but it didn't reach really the boardroom. Is there something that those sustainability experts and the functional experts can learn from that and improve on in terms of their way of engaging on these subjects?
Well, I think it really comes down to what institutional investors say that they care about. In today's world, we counsel clients to engage with their shareholders as appropriate. Most of that engagement is obviously shareholders engaging with management, but at appropriate times the board should be involved in that engagement, especially if shareholders request it. But part of that is sustainability part of the mantra or the ideals that the institutional investors are very focused on. If institutional investors are simply focused on what the stock price is, they're going to be read as focusing on the stock price issues, not on sustainability issues. So it's important that when companies and institutional investors engage, if they care about sustainability, that become part of the dialogue and discussion, so that the management teams and boards understand the importance of sustainability and climate change issues to their shareholder base.
Yeah, I get that. I must say I had a couple of conversations relatively recently with representatives from institutional investors, and one of the things they said is that in a number of investor calls, they have the experience that when it comes to ESG issues, that the board then brings in their expert, and they feel that there is not enough solid knowledge around it to be able to oversee what management does from the board side. Is that something you see as well?
We see, I mean, certainly that happens in some situations, but boards can't be expert in every issue, but they should be educated by people that have that expertise. And it shouldn't just be a single board member that's focused on this. It needs to be on the board's full agenda. Even if a committee focuses on that, the sustainability issues, like through a health and safety committee or an audit committee, it's important that the entire board be briefed on the company's approach so that the directors can give their own perspective. I think that expertise from the management team and making sure the management team is focused on the right issues is the key to whether or not you have a successful sustainability policy. Simply bringing in an expert but not having that filter down to the management team is not going to achieve a lot. The goal is not to have the board be an expert on sustainability and climate change. It needs to know that management has the right focus and the right involvement in the issues so that it is viewed as a priority as part of the strategic plan.
Yeah, I think this is very clear. I mean, this would be getting crazy if we expect them to be experts on cybersecurity and sustainability and all the other issues that are around there, but they have to be at a level where they can make decent decisions and oversight, of course. But we've been discussing this from a perspective of risk, but what I see is the fact that more and more investors are raising these questions and that these notions are coming up, and the Larry Fink letter is probably just an indication of that. The fact is that investors seem to be looking for long-term viability and sustainability of companies, and they see that companies who have that oversight are performing better. Is that your experience?
I think it's important that companies, determine how much of a priority sustainability is. If sustainability is seen as important and is incorporated into the business plan, you certainly could have better performance, but it depends how it's incorporated in. If it's simply a reporting requirement that does not impact the strategic plan in a meaningful way, it's not going to be very helpful in that regard. If it's where there's feedback so that sustainability drives, for example, if you're in the manufacturing business, what happens to extra resources? Do they get shared? Do they get put back in, or are they wasted? And business plans that take that into account and say, look, we can make an investment of X million dollars and then take these byproducts and use them or sell them, and so we have a much higher use of sustainability. That's going to be very effective.
Yeah, no, I get that, and I think it's important what we already said. It's E and S, of course, that we're talking about environment and social, because there's still very often that misconception that sustainability stands for environmental risks and opportunities. Having said that, I understand that we have Hannah back online. David, I suggest we get Hannah in the conversation and give her the chance to continue her presentation, and then we join the three of us the conversation. Is that okay with you?
I think that's very important that Hannah be part of the conversation because, frankly, Ceres is one of the leaders in this area, and it's something that both institutional investors and boards of directors turn to as an important resource.
Absolutely. Thank you. Hannah, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Oh, wonderful. You're not muffled anymore. That's great. Please continue. Sorry for this interruption.
Fantastic. Thank you, and thank you, David, for those kind words about Ceres and our program. So I think that I will just pick up where I left off, diving into what our specific governance program focuses on, which is really all about supporting boards and adopting effective oversight practices for sustainability. And we focus on boards for three key main reasons. The first is that they, of course, influence the company's leadership. They set the incentives for C-suite leaders. They sit at the top of the organization's hierarchical structure. And of course, they're also fiduciaries to investors. And when we think about how we work with boards, we really think about it in two main ways. The first is engaging boards as institutions to really set up strong and effective systems for sustainability oversight. And the second is to really engage directors as individuals, since this is a really highly networked and oftentimes under-leveraged constituency. So we do this in a couple of different ways. The first step that we've taken over the past 5 years that we've been our own individual program at Ceres is to release and set up a number of leading practices and recommendations in 4 reports that we've released. You'll see there up on the slide. And these reports were done by speaking directly with investors, with directors, with corporate governance professionals and lawyers to really get a sense of how oversight of these issues is playing out in the boardroom and what specific recommendations can we make to boards to really advance their oversight of these issues. So in terms of the institutions and seeing boards as institutions, we really work and leveraging these leading practices that we've developed in our reports through specific presentations to company boards. We also work directly with in-house corporate counsel, both individually as well as through membership associations such as the ACC, the Association of Corporate Counsel, and corporate secretaries through the Society of Corporate Governance. And of course, we also work with investors as pressure points on boards. And one of the things I'll talk about a little bit later is the very increased focus that we've seen from investors on not just what corporations are doing on environmental and social issues, but particularly the role of the board in overseeing what the corporation is doing in terms of setting metrics and targets and overseeing how these issues are integrated within risk and things like that. On the individual side, we at Ceres reach a lot of directors through an ongoing partnership with the National Association of Corporate Directors, one of the leading membership associations of directors in the United States. And we also really integrate our leading practices and recommendations throughout director training that are put on by groups such as the NACD, the CEO group, and others. So for us, really when it comes down to getting the board's attention on environmental and social issues, it comes down to materiality, because corporate boards cannot be expected to oversee all environmental or social issues that may impact the company. Their focus and their duty is to really oversee those issues that are material to the corporation. And what we've seen is that there is mounting evidence that only continues to increase on the financial impacts of issues such as climate change and other sustainability topics. So the science is particularly clear. On the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change most recent report, they've really hit home that we have about 12 years to prevent some of the most catastrophic losses from extreme heat, floods, droughts, and poverty for hundreds of billions of people. We're seeing increasing extreme weather events. So floods that were 100-year floods are now happening with increasing frequency, and hurricanes, other natural disasters. In fact, recent flooding in Nebraska totaled about $1.5 billion in damages alone. And then, of course, in 2017, we had record-breaking damages incurred by the 3 major hurricanes, totaling about $306.2 billion in damages. We're also seeing these issues impact corporations directly as financial risk. The title up there is about PG&E, where their liability exposure related to the 2018 California wildfires actually led the company to declare bankruptcy in early 2019. And we're also seeing a number of increasing litigation come up around climate change. And so far in the United States, we have seen about 9 counties and cities sue major fossil fuel companies compensation for damage incurred by climate change. And the last piece here is really the investor engagement. So one campaign that's highlighted here is called the Climate Action 100 Plus, which is a group of about 300 plus investors representing 31 trillion in assets under management that have engaged in a 5-year effort to engage the 150 most carbon-intensive companies in the world to really ensure that their investments in those companies will continue to turn a profit in a world that will likely move to contain climate change, global warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius. So building on this increasing investor expectation on ESG governance and the role of the board, we've also seen a number of shareholder resolutions growth, particularly focusing on what investors and folks in the area are calling climate competent boards. So boards and directors that are really comprised of individuals and decision-making processes that understand that these issues do pose material risks and opportunities and have decided to integrate them into a way that they discuss and deliberate over business strategy, risk management, and compensation. So we've seen major asset owners such as CalPERS and CalSTRS, some of the largest public pension funds in the United States, call on boards of their portfolio companies to onboard directors with expertise in climate change. And we've also seen major asset managers such as BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard mention in their annual letters to CEOs not just the importance of focusing on sustainability, but in particular how a board needs to really be overseeing these issues when material to the company in question. And the last thing I'll tee up here is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures recently released final framework, which is a disclosure framework that was chaired by Mike Bloomberg in the task force set up by the Financial Stability Board to really apply to all companies across multiple sectors on how to evaluate their company's exposure to climate risk, particularly for an investor and lender underwriter audience. And as one of the 4 key pillars of this recommendation, one of them is particularly on governance and exactly asking questions and asking for companies to disclose the role of the board and what they're doing. So while there's this very clear business case that investors are seeing and calling for and asking for from companies, we're really not seeing that play out in the understanding of directors themselves in how these issues may impact their own company. So you'll see on the left-hand side the NACD Public Company Governance Survey from last year, when the survey directors were asked what trends you foresee having the greatest effect on your company over the next year, only 6% mentioned climate change. And in the most recent PwC survey of directors, the headline really for the environmental and social questions are that directors are not seeing these issues as posing financial or material risks, and therefore not really prioritizing them in boardroom deliberations, both in terms of the expertise that they say that's not important for directors to possess on these issues, as well as the impacts on company strategy. And you also have a finding saying that about 1/3 of directors surveyed think that shareholders are devoting too much attention to these types of topics. So at Ceres, after we rolled out many of our leading practices in our reports, we really wanted to conduct a benchmark analysis of 475 of the world's largest companies to ask 3 main questions. The first is, what are the governance systems in place on these boards to oversee sustainability? Are they any good? And do their existence make a difference in the sustainability performance of the company? So what we found was that while many large companies state that their boards oversee sustainability, when you take a look at what the systems are in place, they're largely just getting started, or they're done in a piecemeal, check-the-box fashion. And when I say systems for sustainability, we researched 3 major systems. The first is whether companies had a formal mandate for sustainability, meaning if there was at least one board committee charter that mentioned specifically that that committee oversaw sustainability. The second was sustainability expertise. So did at least one board director possess expertise on an environmental or social issue that impacted the company? And the third is if the company linked a portion of their executive compensation program to a sustainability metric. So the other major findings of the report really underscored our theory of change and our mission of our program, which is that the companies with these board systems in place realized greater sustainability performance and signed on to a greater number of sustainability commitments. and that the best performing companies on sustainability had integrated systems for governance, meaning that they didn't just have one, but they often had two of those systems or three of those systems in place. And I think one thing that's definitely worth mentioning here is that while those three elements were the systems that we looked at to evaluate companies, by no means is that sort of the end point for governance at the board of these issues. These are really proxies for the systems and structures that are set up at the board level, as well as proxies for decision making at the board level. And oftentimes, boards or companies may say, we've got the committee charter that includes sustainability, we're done. And governance is really all about how people are structured to make the best decisions possible. And so because people are involved in that equation, boards are comprised of people, really this is about nuancing the recommendations and how boards can continue to evolve their decision making in terms of understanding how environmental and social issues really play out across business strategy, risk oversight, and compensation. So after we found the results of the benchmark of systems rule, we started to look at what resources existed for boards who really wanted to advance their own governance practices on sustainability. And in this case, we were focusing particularly on climate change, given its wide-reaching impact across sectors. We really couldn't find anything in particular that was written specifically for the board. So what we did last year is we released a primer specifically for corporate directors called Getting Climate Smart, which makes the business case for why climate change is a board relevant issue, which includes why oversight of the board to look at business impacts from climate change is a director's job and often priority to oversee, how directors can oversee these impacts, and in particular, how they can identify if their business is ready for the impacts of climate change with best practices and tools. So this resource is particularly focused on climate, and I would say that if you're listening to the webinar and you're thinking there are other sustainability topics that I'm really interested in understanding how a board could oversee, I would point you to another series resource that's called Lead from the Top, which provides recommendations on how a board can become a sustainability competent board. So we took the concept of a climate competent board and broadened it to larger E&S issues. And all of those reports are available actually for download underneath the resources part of the webinar system. So I will stop there and turn it back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Hannah. It's on the one hand, it's really encouraging what you say, but on the other hand, it's sort of also putting a realistic perspective on it when I look at the results of what importance is given to these matters. Would you say that the new reporting standard that is being, and if we talk about climate for a second, around climate risk exposure, which is the so-called TCFD, the Task Force for Climate Risk Disclosure, is that helping making it more tangible by including scenario analysis and putting financial numbers to it? Would you say that can help?
It's a great question, and the answer is absolutely yes. I think for a long time, these issues have been seen as sort of squishy issues or relegated to the non-financial bucket of issues. And so the more that these impacts are quantified and have dollar signs put in front of them, either through a company's own scenario analysis published in a TCFD report or another report, as well as some of the dollar signs, the figures, the metrics that are coming out, honestly, at this point every month, assigning a dollar figure to how climate change and other sustainability issues can impact corporations and governments. I think the more important that is to get these issues from a non-financial bucket to really realizing what the true financial impacts could be.
Yeah. David, when I hear what Hannah says and what you said before, I think the element of materiality analysis to understand what is really relevant plays an important role to make the board oversight work. But then I ask myself, I have discussed it with a number of people, what you consider material in the context of sustainability? What are the criteria? How do you see it?
That's a very good question, Yuba. And the bottom line is, it varies from company to company, and I think that you know the question really should be focused more on how does sustainability impact our company's business? What risks does it present? And if you go into it from that direction, you also can see what opportunities sustainability really provides to companies. And when they focus on that issue in that particular way, not just in the negative sense about how it hurts the company, but perhaps how sustainability can help the company, it's much easier to integrate it into the business plan, the strategy, and the board and management dialogue on these types of issues.
Yeah, I would like to hear, Hannah, do you see it the same way? Because I feel that just coming from the risk side could actually blindside you a little bit for really big opportunities, but maybe I'm getting this wrong.
Mm-hmm. No, it's a great point, Uwe, and we're actually working on a report right now for release this fall, diving into how boards can oversee risks posed from climate change and other sustainability issues. So I would say that it's a big topic, and it's certainly something that's top of mind for many directors now, and I'd say it's within their membership associations as well. I think the fear that the next big risk coming could be from climate or a climate-related impact, and that it could cause systemic implications across companies, across multiple sectors of the economy, is certainly one of the key issues that I think lots of groups and lawyers are trying to get across. But I would say that from a widespread understanding within the corporate director community, we're not quite there yet.
Understand. David, sorry, I was sort of challenging a little bit what you said. Would you agree that one really has to deliberately also look at the opportunities, because what we see that some companies are really successful in doing that?
Look, I think that it is essential that you not just study this from the risk side, understanding the risks of not having a high sustainability score or not being viewed as positive in this area is obviously important, and how it can impact your business plan from a risk perspective is important. But for many of these companies, sustainability is actually a positive opportunity. And if you look at it from both directions, what risks does sustainability present and what opportunities does it provide? I think you're coming at it from two different directions, and it's something that boards can more easily challenge the management team on. How have you used this in a positive way? Not just how you've mitigated the risks, but how you've taken it into account. If you're a manufacturing company and you can say that you're using a certain amount of recycled materials, and that's a positive sustainability thing, and you sell more products that way, that's an opportunity. If you simply ignore the issue, you can't ignore the risk, but you're certainly not going to get the benefits out of it. And I think the point that Hannah makes, which is, boards need to be engaged, but for boards to be engaged, it has to be a priority for institutional investors as well. And if institutional investors are challenging management teams on sustainability and climate change issues, it tends to work its way to the board relatively quickly, and it's something where there can be a dialogue with the board about both the risks and the benefits from these types of issues.
Very clear, thank you. And talking about challenging assumptions, one of our participants here, Juan Manuel, he asked, frequently we observe differences among experts about predictions and scenarios. To what extent should directors challenge the assumptions of analysis and look for a variety of sources from the academic community when analyzing climate change?
I'll take a crack at that, and I'm sure Hannah has some perspective on it too. But you can't just rely on a single expert. The same way, if you have a crisis problem in cybersecurity, you're not going to talk to one cybersecurity expert. You're going to be talking to multiple parties to see that you get a comprehensive look at it. To me, the key is educating the board on these types of issues so they know what questions to ask. It may be helpful if there's one or two directors who are more proficient in this area, but whether the board has an expert on the board or talks to an expert, it needs to know what questions to ask the management team. And if you simply have the issues from one expert's perspective and ignore all of the others, I think you're missing an opportunity and you're not going to fully understand the risks.
Mm-hmm. And I couldn't agree more with that. And, another element to this is when boards are thinking about what sources to tap for this information, we really recommend that they take a look at various different stakeholders within the company to get this information. I think, this particular question focuses on, differing among academic experts. I think when it comes down to the board's oversight, they're really going to be asking very pointed questions of management around how these issues will impact their own business. And so I think to get a sense of that, they need to ensure that the management team is going out and not only looking at academic sources, but also other stakeholders, that can certainly provide important information as to how these issues are impacting all areas of the company. So, build on what David is saying, boards need to not just ask management these questions, but they also need to have a good sense of where the information is coming from and really push management to make sure that they're getting the right information from a diversity of sources so that they can move ahead with making the most informed decisions possible.
One other way to look at this issue, though, is to look at it from a long-term perspective. And if the board is focused on this from a long-term perspective and how it can affect different constituencies, employees, communities, stockholders, management, etc., I think that it's going to be better focused because the issues of climate change and sustainability, yes, they can have short-term impacts, but the question is the corporation in position to deal with these risks and opportunities over the longer term. And as boards tend to focus more on it from that perspective, I think you're going to see more buy-in, and I think you're going to see better communications with the institutional investors as long as they're looking at it the same way. If you ask, for example, do I make this investment today that's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars because it will help the company, over the next 20 years, or do I defer this several years until I have better cash flows? Those are the way you have to look at some of these issues. It cannot be just a short-term focus. It needs to be a focus on the mid and long term as well.
Absolutely. And the long-term focus, I think, ties into the question you asked earlier, Uwe, about scenario analysis. Because if a company is conducting scenario analysis, and this is another great question for the board to be asking of management, is over what time frame were you looking at these impacts, right? And then to make business decisions based off of that. They need to be able to look at scenario analyses and understand how these issues can impact a company over a wide variety of time horizons. That's particularly part of what we expect from the board, while management may certainly be driven and motivated to have a bit more of a short-term focus. Really where the board steps in with a unique vantage point is stewarding the corporation's purpose and making sure the corporation will be fit for purpose over the long term. So that's, I think, another really critical question for the board to be asking the management, particularly when it comes to scenario analysis.
Thank you. I hope, Juan Manuel, we have answered your question, and you've given a good example of raising important points. I can only encourage the audience to raise more questions or make statements. And whilst we're doing that, I would like to come back to something that I saw written by you, Hannah, saying that when you looked at the statistics, first of all, it wasn't so encouraging to see that mainly in boards there is one expert rather than a wide base. And secondly, and that in the first instance was a bit surprising to me, but on reflection might make sense, that you saw a lot higher percentage of female experts on boards dealing with sustainability issues than male board members. Do you have a view on that, why that is?
Yeah, so this was a really interesting finding from the same PwC report I mentioned earlier. So as part of the questions that they asked in that survey to U.S. corporate directors, they asked the question, how important do you think environmental and social issues will be? What kind of impact do you think they'll have on the corporation? And then based on those responses and the gender of the respondents, they did a breakdown. And what they actually found was that male directors were more likely to say that those issues wouldn't impact corporate strategy, and female directors were much more likely to say that they would. And this sort of highlighted this interesting dichotomy that we've heard about directly from sort of anecdotally from a lot of the directors that we work with, where they seem to think that there's more of a focus and more a likelihood that the director who winds up raising these issues as business risks and opportunities are more likely to be female, and that there's already a gender imbalance on U.S. corporate boards that's been well documented. And what they don't want to happen is to have sustainability issues siloed to one particular member of the board who may also happen to be female or be the diversity candidate. Particularly as MSCI did this great study where they evaluated the decision making of corporate boards, particularly when it came down to the breakdown of gender. And they found that there's a tipping point where there have to be 3 or more women on a board to really have their opinions considered and integrated into widespread board deliberations. So we don't want to fall into an issue where, while there is increasing focus on boards to onboard women or to onboard people with sustainability expertise, that doesn't become a check the box mentality just to satisfy the demands of an investor or other stakeholders, and then that person's contributions are siloed. So, I think David touched on this a little bit earlier, but the importance of they're educating the entire board, or really thinking through how these conversations and how these issue expertise can be widespread addressed by the entire board. It doesn't just sit in one committee. It doesn't just rest as a responsibility with one particular board member. It's really the entire board's responsibility to understand when these issues are material, when they pose implications to business strategy, having them be discussed at the full board level.
Thank you, Hannah. We
Hannah,
had
just to push your
Please go
point
ahead.
a little bit. We've seen boards that have more women on them. It's not just sustainability that's the issue. It's frankly, they tend to focus much more on risk. And I don't, one can conjecture why that is, but the bottom line is that the academic data really proves the point. And I think that, it's a question of integrating those priorities or those issues into the overall dynamic. If risk issues are left by themselves, you can have the best enterprise risk management program in the world, but if it doesn't get integrated into your business plan, you're never going to see the promising results from it. And I think that as more women come on boards, that will increasingly happen because of the focus on risk. The other point I would make is that it's not, frankly, boards shouldn't just be focusing on what the gender or other diversity is. They need diversity of experience. And that diversity of experience often involves candidates either with gender diversity or other types of diversity. But if you focus on the expertise, the people are out there and you can really benefit from it. But it's not just a question of having a single member of the board focused on it. It's making sure the entire board is involved in the process.
Thank you so much,
Exactly.
David, for making the diversity point very strongly. And I think we all agree on the benefits here. We have another question from Lynn for you, David, and for Hannah. To what extent do you see CFOs getting involved in sustainability issues?
Mm-hmm. This is an interesting one, and
go ahead, Hannah.
Sure. I think right now, it's at least in the United States, it's certainly a bit piecemeal. At our series annual conference a few months ago, our opening plenary featured two CFOs, one from National Grid and one from Salesforce, who spoke very strongly about the importance of really integrating what a company is doing around sustainability from both the risks and opportunities side within the accounting and the financial accounting component of everything that the CFO does, particularly as usually that department will run the risk management, the ERM, the enterprise risk management process. I think that those two companies are certainly leading on that front. That's really not something we see replicated across a wide variety of CFOs. And one organization that's been working with CFOs to advance leadership in this area is Accounting for Sustainability, which has, I think, much larger following in Europe and Canada, and just opened up a US chapter a couple of months ago. And their goal is to really directly engage CFOs in this process. I think in terms of where the board could be involved in how CFOs and how the CFO's department is involved, is to really ask questions around, continue to ask questions around the risk opportunity side of things, and ensuring that their oversight of the risk management process is driving CFOs and the financial accounting to really account for sustainability within these processes, to include the results of scenario analysis, and to really embed that within how a company is thinking through ERM.
Thank you, Anna. David?
And I agree with you, but the point I guess I would make is the CFO is almost always one of the people that's engaging with investors. And if they do not engage with investors on these types of issues, and it's left to simply the CEO or a business unit person, I think if investors push back and say, why isn't this something that the CFO is focused on, is knowledgeable about, you will see more and more CFOs getting involved. I think that many times they don't expect to get answers from the CFO. It's directed more at other members of the management team. But the CFO function, both from a risk perspective, but also from a financial perspective, should take into account a lot of these issues.
Absolutely. Thank you, David. And I must say, I can confirm that what we're experiencing from the Sustainability Center of the Conference Board is that our CFO and economist councils are increasingly asking members of the center to come and present to them about sustainability issues. So that also is for me an indication that awareness is increasing, and the need to have reasonable responses to investors is indicating that as well. We're getting to the end, unfortunately. This has been an extremely interesting conversation, and appreciate the questions from the audience. Hannah and David, thank you so much for your insights. This has been extremely valuable. Our next webcast in this series is going to be about total impact valuation. We have a summer break in August, but we will be back on the 19th of September. And before we finish, I would like to ask you all to spend just the 2 minutes at the end of this and click on the webcast evaluation form and give us some feedback, because that will help us to improve our service to you through these webcasts. Thank you again to the panel, and thank you to the audience, and goodbye until next time.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.